Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around the custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case. There were some experiences he related that I had previously been unaware of regarding my ex's behavior at networking events. After this initial call, he started to call on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. Mind you, this was not someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was also much older than I was, but claimed to be very experienced with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. His testimony was really important to my case, per the words of my lawyer. I kept things strictly friendly, but I always got a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day, and that happened to be a day my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me. Honestly, I really appreciated that. After that, though, he kept on dropping by the house uninvited, or would stop by with various gifts for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to simply keep things polite. The divorce was coming soon anyway. I really couldn't afford to make this guy mad. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key that same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after that day, he came around once again uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls altogether and took my son and dog to stay at my parents' for several weeks to avoid another drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he must have gotten the hint by now. It was a very quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing, something like the zoo, I believe. We both came back quite hot and tired. I put my kid down for a nap in my bed and decided to lay down and close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later. It took me a moment to realize that something was way off here. As I was blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table. I had most definitely not put that there. There was a post-it note on it as well, something about planting it in the yard. I recognized the handwriting immediately and stood up to go splash some water on my face. I tried to decide whether to simply call my parents or phone the police. As I stepped in my bathroom, I realized the mirror was now covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages, love notes, and calls of affection. Honestly, it really scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how all this could have possibly gotten into my house in the hour I was asleep. The front door was still definitely locked. As I went from room to room, though, there were notes placed everywhere. I mean thousands of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started to grab all of them and put them into a big pile. Then I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. You know, you're really cute when you think no one is watching you. I realized then that there was a security camera pointed right where that note had been left. The one that man had helped me set up months earlier, when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics. I sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, this was during a custody battle. He said instead he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. That was the initial purpose, at least. This man had access, though, and could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. The security cameras, I realized, he had copied my passwords when I was setting up the system. The only way I could figure out that he got into my house is he must have made a copy of my house key the day I gave it to him. Because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to try to warn me either. That scared me the most. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes very quickly. He must have been right next to me, feet away from my son while we were both sleeping, and somehow he thought all this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what the guy was going to do when he realized he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night. I was home alone, on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., the man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all of the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking as well. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts as well, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had secretly befriended my mom on Facebook and therefore was still able to see all of the photos of us she posted or shared. I saw when she left her computer logged on that they were having a conversation about how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing up. I'm more than relieved he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online now. I changed all the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends. I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos. I was already traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. Alright, here we go. Nearly a year ago now, on Christmas Day, I was at my dad's with some of my siblings. We celebrated Christmas. Then after dinner, my dad headed off to be with his girlfriend at her apartment. Left in the house were my 16-year-old uncle, my 16-year-old brother, me who was 15, and the youngest who was still only a toddler. I woke up early the next morning, the day after Christmas, and sat on the floor beside an outlet on my tablet. Everyone else was still sleeping when I began to hear a banging on the back door. At first, I thought it was my dad coming back, but the banging got louder and went on for far too long. For lack of a better term, I guess I dissociated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move until I heard the back door breaking in. I had been paranoid about home invasion due to our area in the city before, but I had no idea what to do in this situation. All I could do was stand there in shock. I put down my tablet slowly and picked up a nearby flashlight. I think my thought process was to attack whoever broke in with it. When the back door gave out, I heard the person quickly go through the downstairs and stomp up the stairs. It seemed he stopped right outside the door of the room I was in. The man opened the door, turned left, turned right, and then saw me sitting there on the floor, beside the outlet less than 3 feet away from him. He was taller than my dad, wearing a completely black ski mask. He held a big rusty crowbar with a blue handle. He was wide and looked a bit on the older side as well. In that moment, I took a small breath and screamed louder than I ever have before. It must have lasted for a good 20 seconds. Once I screamed, he yelped a bit too, then ran downstairs and out of the house. I went to the top of the staircase after he was already down them and out the hallway. I screamed out for him to please leave. Looking back, I guess asking a house invader to leave is kind of useless, especially when he's already leaving and he'd already broken in. But I'm sure you can imagine I was not thinking at my best in the moment. My screaming woke up my uncle and older brother. I told my older brother what just happened, as he was half awake and extremely confused. I ran downstairs. My uncle had just come up from his room in the basement. I quickly told him someone had broken in and left after I screamed at them. He already had a knife on him and told me to grab one too. I did after making sure the robber had left the house and checking quickly on the toddler, who was somehow sleeping through all of this. My uncle told me to guard the back door and stab anyone who came through while he checked the area outside. We could find neither hide nor hair of where the robber had gone. I held the knife and stood beside the broken back door, knowing that if he came back, I really couldn't do anything. I'd never fought anyone before, and I was just a child holding a small knife. Thankfully, they didn't try to return. My uncle came back and said they must have had a getaway driver, since there was no way he could have gotten away so fast on foot. None of us had phones, so my older brother called my dad over Instagram on a tablet to tell him what happened. We explained everything. We all sat and waited for my dad. We talked and realized this had likely been very planned. The invader came in when there was no car in the driveway, and after entering, he ran directly upstairs, ignoring all the new Christmas presents, the electronics, an expensive alcohol collection, and even 2 easy-to-grab game consoles smack dab in the middle of the living room. He went directly for my dad's room, where me and my brother were. My dad collects valuable shoes, and I guess has some expensive watches he keeps in the closet. Only someone who was friends with my dad, who'd been in the house before, would have known about those collections, and known the right place to go as well. When my dad came back, he asked me over and over about how the intruder looked. I told him again and again, while he and my uncle tried to think of which friend it could have been. I was the only one who'd saw the guy, and had been less than 3 feet away from him. I was in direct physical danger from some stranger I'd never met. We didn't call the cops, as the police in our area are known for being less than unhelpful. As Christmas is getting closer again, I'm worried about being back there around the same time that person broke in. I've had a harder time sleeping, and I've been more paranoid as well. I understand I was and am very lucky that I wasn't hurt, and all we got was a broken back door. But honestly, I really hate the person who broke in. I really hope that wherever he is, nobody likes him. I've hesitated to share this story for a long time because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord/maintenance staff is. I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories before about dangerous, scary residents I encountered while working at apartment complexes, but this is a story about the other side of things as a renter. Before I had even graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at the time, drawn in by the multiple amenities I would never use. But I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet-friendly and also within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment they had available and moved in. Unfortunately, I soon came to realize this apartment was not as nice as I'd originally thought it was. The building was old but remodeled, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and extremely thin walls. I also learned it was not the safest part of town either. I was primarily an online student, but I had one class that met in person twice a week, around 8 a.m. or so. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the day, except for that class. Maybe the occasional shopping excursion or to spend some time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle. Even though it was only 600 square feet and I lived alone, things had a way of growing legs and simply walking away and disappearing. I had 2 kittens at the time and blamed them regularly for all these things going missing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I'd find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I knew I had class. I didn't have a proper dresser, instead using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes. You know, one for socks, one for pants, one for pajamas, etc. I could have sworn I'd put the underwear box away after getting ready for class, but I simply chalked it up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up so early. Arguably paranoid, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well. Favorite articles of clothing would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back out. And towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called me to let me know his roommate had accidentally locked him out of their apartment. I had a spare key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick and let him in. Before I left, I made a mental note that I had left literally every light in my apartment on. Because I was living on a pretty tight budget, normally I'd make a point of turning off all the lights when I left, but my boyfriend lived like 5 minutes away, so I knew I was going to be back very quickly anyway. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. Immediately though, I could sense something was off. I could see the lights were now off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and went inside. The lights had all been turned off. Thinking maybe I'd had a power outage, I flipped the main light, only for it to immediately come on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment. No one was inside, but someone had definitely gone through and systematically turned off every light, including my lizard's basking light, my laptop as well. We called the emergency maintenance number, and I explained that someone had been inside my apartment. They had to have used a key, because there was no sign of forced entry either. The manager called me back and told me I had to be imagining things. Maybe I'd just forgotten before I left. I assured him I wouldn't have turned off the lizard light to kill my own lizard. Someone had definitely been in my apartment. I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or had been a previous tenant or guest. I asked if they had changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me they changed the locks every time. They then tried to suggest maybe it was a friend pranking me, someone else I had given a key to. Well, the only other people I had given keys to were my boyfriend and my mom, one of which was obviously with me right now. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way anyway. After enough finagling, the manager finally agreed to send someone out to change the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern it was someone on staff, since they would be the only other people with keys. The manager claimed the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera as well. They changed the locks, but I had my doubts it would do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance guys that worked on the complex. One nice older man that didn't seem all that skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard who gave off a very bad vibe. I suspected it was him immediately. When I had first moved in, the manager had told me I would be getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come. Then after a few months, I had completely forgotten about it. One day, I was sitting in my living room, and this scruffy maintenance guy walked in without knocking or announcing himself. I hadn't received a notice to expect him either. He said he was there to replace my countertop, but it took him 2 days to install one small piece of the counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower when I heard a single knock at the door. I called out and hurried to get some clothes. Not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut, still wrapped in a towel, to stop him from just coming in. He claimed he hadn't heard me, but I had my doubts. Another time, I found a note from him that he had come in while I was gone. Again, no reason given as to why. He made a note about my 3rd cat being cute as well. Except I didn't have a 3rd cat there. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I kept all my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note in my file that A, I wanted at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward, and B, to always be present when they tried to come in. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all added up together. It hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all the time, so he must have known when I would come and go. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen? He could have been coming in while I was asleep, and I would have never known. After the night with the lights, I put my own lock on the door. I still didn't totally trust the apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, subleased the apartment, and moved. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff. While she was home alone, as I was at class, She caught the scruffy maintenance guy trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said he was there to paint the front door. I didn't receive any notice, and he didn't have any supplies either. She told him he could wait until after I moved out. A few years later, I was shopped by the owner of Paradise Apartments while working at another complex in town. Shopping, by the way, is when an employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information they might not easily give up. There were certain tells a shopper always gave. Asking specifically worded questions that required specific answers and were easy to trip up on. Being too wealthy for the complex, being too flexible on what they were interested in. The guy seemed too old and too well off to be considering an apartment at where I worked. Normally, I wouldn't have badmouthed any other complexes. I preferred to win them over by showing them the positives of our community, but I told him I probably wasn't the best person to tell him about Paradise Apartments. I told him about my breaking in and that I suspected it was someone on the maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed he was now the owner and was very disturbed to hear I'd had this experience. He asked me to describe the man in detail. I assured him it was all in past and I was over it, but he insisted on calling the manager. He answered that yes, there had been a scruffy young maintenance man he'd had to fire because he'd been caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me the issue had been resolved and asked if I would be willing to change my bad review. I told him no. None of this changed the fact I'd experienced this. Actually, it validated everything I expected. In the years I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time. From my experience, a lot don't switch out the locks if the previous tenant was good. A lot didn't require background checks for employees even though they did for the tenants, and keys also got passed out willy-nilly to maintenance and vendors and basically everyone who worked there. I wouldn't go so far as to say everyone operates this way, but everyone I worked at was doing this when I started there. If you're renting an apartment, be sure to stay diligent. If you have reason to believe someone is coming into your home, document it and let the staff and friends know. You never know who might have a key to your apartment. They seem to give those things out to everyone. So here's my story. For context, I live away from home for school, while my sister lives at home with our parents. Also, both our rooms face the street and are right next to each other. I have a full-length mirror in my room just opposite the window, so if I look into the mirror, I can see what's outside as well. Around Thanksgiving of 2021, I had just gotten home from school and was relishing my ability to stay up late. So was my sister. After our parents had gone to sleep, I was just laying on my bed watching some YouTube. I had my window blinds wide open when for some strange reason, I felt the sudden need to look up immediately. My head snapped up to look in the mirror. Outside, I saw someone pop up from below my window. They began to bang on it 3 times before suddenly sprinting away. I was shaking, on the verge of tears. I ran to my sister's room and explained what just happened. She was shaken up as well, but we chalked it up to just a dumb teenager. Just a few nights later at midnight, though, I see a text from my sister. "Hey, did you hear that? There was somebody in front of my window." I felt that same fear. I took my headphones off and just began to get up when I heard 5 super loud bangs come from my sister's window. I ran over immediately. She looked really shaken. She told me the man ran to the other side of the house, the wall that was right next to my bed. He began to bang on my wall, right where my head would normally be. We were frozen in fear. We didn't catch the guy as he ran away immediately after. We made some theories as to who it was, but neither of us were the type to have any enemies. We did some investigating and also found out there were no teenagers on our street anyway. None of this made sense. Sometimes I feel that same chill in the air and think I hear the banging. I fear turning around and seeing that man's face in the window might not be as rare as many might hope. I'm praying I never have to meet that person again.